Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 11 lecture. So today we're talking about the African American presence in American cinema, and we're reading that chapter in the book that starts on page 497. And our film for this week is Crooklyn, directed by Spike Lee. So I did make a slight change over the course of the semester. If you look at the syllabus, we were originally scheduled to watch a different Spike Lee movie this week, but I decided to do Crooklyn instead, just because I thought it might be a little bit of an easier watch, a movie that I thought maybe would appeal to us a little bit more, although if you're interested in Do the Right Thing, you can still watch it. It's easy to find, and we'll talk a little bit more about Spike Lee at the end of our lecture, and then we'll get into the movie. So, we'll discuss the chapter a little bit. I want to sort of put a lot of this material back into the historical framework that we've been using throughout the semester. So it's important to note that we don't really have to look at African American cinema as separate or necessarily being a different thing than the rest of American cinema, because as the book points out, African Americans have been involved in movies and movie making since the very beginning. So we can really just look at this as another aspect, another facet of the history that we've been learning throughout the semester. But of course, as we know, for a long time, African Americans were not as visible in a lot of movies. They were very restricted in terms of what kinds of roles they could play in motion pictures, major motion pictures in America. And they were also very limited in terms of their opportunities to make their own films. And that was true for a long time. Things have definitely opened up for African Americans and other minority groups in more recent decades. So we see a lot of different voices and different perspectives now when we look at a lot of American movies. But we already know, just from a general sense of history, that we didn't always have that kind of diversity when it came to different people making movies and sort of expressing their artistic visions. But like the book says, African American performers could be seen in movies going all the way back to the 1890s. The very beginning of movies in this country and most of the rest of the world. But again, as we know, just from our knowledge of American history, for a long time, the sorts of roles that would be written and performed, for and by African American performers would be generally pretty stereotypical, like the book points out, or they would be very racist caricatures that were sort of drawn from earlier forms of media, sort of predecessors of the movies that we've talked about a little bit in this class, particularly vaudeville. So we talked about vaudeville as sort of an earlier art form that really originated in the 19th century before movies existed. And these were like stage performances, kind of similar to stage plays, but they might look a little bit more to us like sketch comedy or like variety shows. So a lot of vaudeville would have featured like short comedic performances, like little brief comedic stage plays, along with maybe some musical numbers and some dancing. They would have, different things. And not all of it would necessarily be comedy. There might have been some serious dramas playing out as well. But they were like early variety shows that would often feature, performances. And in the early days of the movies, as we've already seen, we talked about this a little bit with the Marx Brothers, and we mentioned a lot of the actors who appear in The Wizard of Oz had their start in vaudeville. So when you look at a lot of early movies, at the very end of the 19th century and then the first couple of decades of the 20th century, we've already sort of said that a lot of the actors during that time came from the stage. So some of them were like serious, maybe classically trained stage actors. And then you had a lot of others, the ones who did a lot of comedy or musicals. A lot of them had a background in vaudeville. where they would have been doing songs and dances and comedic sketches for audiences, and they often would have been traveling and maybe, performing in different cities. So this was a tradition and a sort of artistic form that continued even after movies came along, but it, declined in popularity and was largely gone by the middle of the 20th century. So a lot of modern people, even people as old as me, don't really have much of a recollection of vaudeville. We probably haven't seen it, but you can watch, old footage, and it's just sort of a part of this history because, like other forms of media, like stage plays, opera, some other stuff that kind of help pave the way for movies, even radio, which kind of came along at around the same time, but a lot of these technologies were all kind of working together in these different media forms. So we talked a little bit about vaudeville, and there's one sort of aspect of a lot of vaudeville shows that existed well into the 20th century, but then luckily sort of went away, and that would have been what they called blackface minstrel shows. Minstrel shows more generally were just sort of a stage performance, could be part of a vaudeville routine, or it could be something, more standalone. But minstrel shows typically featured African American characters, oftentimes performing music or dancing. In some cases, the performers themselves were African American. That wasn't uncommon. And again, these would often be traveling shows that would go around to different cities, different venues. But in other cases, you would have white performers who would be playing African American characters and doing so in blackface. So they would put on makeup to appear darker, to have a darker complexion, and they would often do a very exaggerated sort of accent or dialect meant to, imitate the stereotypical sort of versions of African American characters that existed back then. So, of course, we find this type of performance pretty offensive today. As we know, we don't really see blackface anymore. Not much, and if you do see it, or if it sort of surfaces as part of somebody's past, it's usually a bit of a scandal. So our perspective on it now is obviously quite a bit different than people would have thought about it 100 years ago. So like I said, minstrel shows were a part of an earlier sort of artistic tradition, but early movies borrowed a lot from these types of shows, and in some cases early movies even featured white performers acting in blackface. And a great example of that is a movie that we've talked about before in this class, The Jazz Singer, which is usually thought of as the very first sound movie in American cinematic history. It comes out in 1927. So vaudeville and minstrel shows were still a reality. They were still pretty common, pretty well known during that time. And in that movie, Al Jolson plays the protagonist, and his character in the film is a Jewish American performer who often performs in blackface and does songs and other sort of sketches, basically imitating or impersonating a black character, a very sort of stereotypical black character. And that's why the movie is regarded by some today as kind of racist in terms of its content, in terms of the way African Americans are sort of portrayed. But it is important to note that in the film, the character himself is shown as a young Jewish man, and actually that's where a lot of the drama of the film comes from. His sort of traditional religiously conservative parents want him to become a rabbi or something, I think, or sort of go into a more respectable profession, but instead he wants to be a jazz singer, he wants to be a performer. But in the movie, it's very clear he's performing African American music. He's impersonating African American characters, and he's using sort of an exaggerated African American dialect that, again, we would find rather offensive today. It wasn't thought of as offensive back then, but that's part of the reason why the movie has aged rather poorly, and it's now just sort of a historical footnote. Oh, it's the first sound movie, but not many people actually sit down to watch it, in part because blackface is such a big part of it. So that's just a part of the history that we sort of have to acknowledge. And it obviously limited, like I was saying, this really limited opportunities for African American performers and potential filmmakers for a long time. Like the book says, in these early days of the movies, black characters were mostly just used as comic relief. For white audiences. You wouldn't have had black characters that were very well developed. They usually wouldn't have been the main characters of a movie. They would have been comic relief. They wouldn't have had very much screen time, and they would have been portrayed in a pretty offensive, stereotypical way. Another great example of this is another famous early American film that I've mentioned before, at least in passing. Birth of a Nation, which comes out in 1915, directed by D.W. Griffith, and it was a real technical achievement. It was sort of a landmark achievement when it came out in the 19-teens because it was very technically innovative. The camera work, the editing, it's sometimes credited as kind of the first action movie, the first movie that really seamlessly incorporated a lot of movement and a lot of what we would just consider action, like people chasing each other on horseback and, fight scenes. And it looks, relatively modern compared to a lot of movies from the 19-teens. And it was also one of the first really sophisticated feature-length movies in America. So it was, close to a modern-day movie's running time at a time when a lot of movies were still pretty short. So it really sort of pushed the envelope as far as technical achievement, the development of its narrative. It was, just in many ways sort of ahead of its time. So it's a very important movie from a historical standpoint, very significant, from a technically speaking, but it also features a lot of really racist portrayals of black characters and really the plot of the movie. This is not an exaggeration. A lot of the heroes of the movie are members of the Ku Klux Klan or sympathizers, sort of people working in concert with the KKK against sort of villainous black characters. That very much is the plot line, which again many modern viewers obviously find very offensive, and that's another issue with some of with old an old movie like this. It has its historical significance, but a lot of modern people feel uncomfortable watching it, and they certainly feel uncomfortable with a lot of the themes, a lot of the plot points in the movie, because the movie really is advocating for white supremacy. D.W. Griffith was a pretty well-known, well-documented, racist who spoke quite a bit about it. And just, it was also based on a book called The Klansman, literally about the Klan, sort of romanticizing individual members of the Klan during a time, unfortunately, in American history where the KKK was very active in a lot of parts of the U.S. Not exclusively the South, although obviously they were there, but they spread to other parts of the country as well. And they were involved, obviously, in a lot of and discriminatory actions against African Americans, but also against, various immigrants, against Catholics, against Jewish people. The KKK targeted a lot of different sort of minority groups or more marginalized groups, and bullied them and terrorized them in a number of ways. So from our modern perspective, very sort of distasteful sort of subject matter. So again, that's a movie that gets remembered, The Birth of a Nation. It gets remembered, but maybe not watched as much, in part because it is very clearly and sort of virulently racist. But also, again, for African American filmmakers during this time, not a lot of avenues, not a lot of opportunities towards making movies of their own. They were obviously discriminated against. They weren't going to get many chances in the Hollywood system. During the golden age of Hollywood that we've discussed, there just really wasn't any room during that time for African American directors or screenwriters or editors or cinematographers. Now, some black performers could find work, but again, in very limited roles. So that was the case for a long time, really throughout pretty much the entire first half of the 20th century. But as the book points out, there's one interesting exception. This guy, Oscar Micheaux, who was really the first African-American filmmaker in the U.S., at least the first one that we can document, the first one that we are aware of. As far as film historians can tell, Micheaux was the first African-American to produce feature-length movies in the U.S., and he also, through his company, distributed the films and arranged for their exhibition. So he was sort of involved in all three levels, that vertical integration of the movie business, because he was operating completely outside of Hollywood. Hollywood at that time would not have, bought his movies or given him a chance to make his movies. So he formed his own company and largely worked out of Chicago, which was pretty separate from the Hollywood machine. And he had to kind of be very DIY. He had to do a lot of this himself because there wasn't much structural support, for a black filmmaker during that time. So he was based in Chicago. He shot a lot of his movies in Chicago, but he also, his production company, had a distribution branch in Virginia. So they were actually able to distribute his movies to several different cities throughout the U.S., mostly in kind of like the mid-Atlantic or the Northeast or the upper Midwest, major cities where there were large African-American populations. Because again, this is during a period of segregation in the U.S., so white and black audiences were often kept separate. So these movies were largely marketed for African-American audiences. And they were pretty successful in the cities where they played. But of course, they never had the budgets. They never had the resources that big-time Hollywood movies would have had during the same time. So one of the few films of his that survives, and it's the oldest surviving film in America directed by an African-American, is called Within Our Gates. And it came out in 1920. It was a silent film. And like a lot of his movies, it tackled sort of social issues of the time, that would have been relevant to African-American characters and audiences. It's kind of an honest look at race relations during that time, during the Jim Crow era, in the U.S. So a very brief plot synopsis, because this type of formula, this type of plot, this kind of melodrama would become somewhat popular. It almost becomes sort of a genre that's sometimes referred to as race movies or like race tragedies or race dramas. A lot of movies would come along with sort of similar plot lines. So there's a young woman who we meet early in the film, and she's going up north. I'm trying to remember all of this. She goes up north. It's a very complex plot. I'm going to really simplify it. She goes up north to get funding for like a school for African-American children. And a bunch of different things happen to her while she's up there. But she eventually meets a doctor, falls in love with the doctor. Many things happen. She's trying to raise money. She sort of falls in with this like wealthy philanthropist. Can't really remember what happens with that. But anyway, it turns out she has this very sort of secret history past as a mixed race woman, and she's been trying to keep that a secret, but I believe she eventually ends up with the doctor. It's kind of a happy ending, I think. So this is kind of a similar template would get sort of enacted in a lot of future movies. Mixed race characters, mistaken identity or a sort of hidden, concealed identity gets revealed. Black characters sort of struggling against, social restrictions, discrimination, lack of opportunity. So Micheaux is able to kind of portray that stuff in a more authentic way, frankly, than you would have seen really in any Hollywood movie. Hollywood movies during that time weren't really talking about race relations. They weren't really looking to comment on those types of social issues. So again, if you saw black characters in a mainstream Hollywood movie, there's a good chance they were in very secondary roles, often performing, perhaps singing, dancing, playing supporting roles, and they were usually portrayed as happy or satisfied or content. You didn't really get any sense of problems, issues facing them. But Michaud was obviously doing something very different. Really the first filmmaker that we're aware of who was able to capture sort of a more authentic, genuine African-American experience during that time, during the 20s. And I believe he worked into the 30s, maybe even the 40s. So he made many films, but a lot of them have been lost. But Within Our Gates, that's the oldest surviving African-American made film in the U.S. So, again, kind of like social commentary, a lot of important messages contained in his films, but he was also a student of film. He knew how to use sort of a popular entertainment framework to package his social messaging. So his plots are usually packed with a lot of events, a lot of melodrama, a lot's going on. And in many ways, the movies were somewhat similar to Hollywood melodramas, but they were tackling obviously different subject matter that was more unique to the African American experience. But after Michaud, a lot more movies would do that in the decades to come. And increasingly, that would be sort of an acceptable genre even for white audiences within a few more decades. So he's an important figure, Oscar Michaud. There's a little breakaway feature about him in the book that starts on page 499. And just another quick note about Within Our Gates before we move on. It featured a pretty well-known actress named Evelyn Preer. She plays the main character in that film, and she was pretty well-known amongst African-American audiences. And she appeared in several of Michaud's films. She was a Chicago-based performer. So she appeared a lot in stage plays. She also did cabaret, musical theater, but she also appeared in a few Hollywood films, usually in very small roles. But she did sort of cross over into more sort of mainstream movies, but tragically died very young, like in her 30s. Died in 1932 when she was only about maybe 35 or 36. But she was very popular during the 20s amongst African American audiences who might have seen her on stage, and they might have seen her in some of Michaud's movies as well. All right, so yeah, speaking of the 20s and 30s and the way black characters continued to be sort of utilized in Hollywood, one genre that became popular during the 20s and 30s is usually referred to as like the plantation drama or like antebellum plantation dramas. We don't see many of these anymore. Again, very sort of dated, very much a byproduct of an earlier time in American history. But these would be movies that sort of dramatized the antebellum South. They would be set, you know, on a plantation in the South before the Civil War sort of ended that way of life. And again, we would find a lot of those sorts of films, those kinds of plots, to be a little bit offensive now. They obviously featured very stereotypical sort of portrayals of black characters, but these were popular during the time. You had several adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the famous abolitionist novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. That was written back in the 19th century, but you had some movie adaptations in the early 20th century. And then, of course, the most famous example of an antebellum plantation drama would be Gone with the Wind. Pretty much the only example most modern viewers would be aware of. That comes out in 1939. As I've mentioned before, that's a very big year for American movies. You have a lot of big movies that come out in that same year. But Gone with the Wind is still remembered. You can still catch it on TV. You might have a parent or a grandparent who's a big fan. I know I do. I remember seeing it as a kid. Again, it's a movie that some people would go ahead and label offensive or even racist, sort of by today's standards. Other people might defend it and say, well, you know, it's a product of its time. we can have differing opinions about it, but it's very much sort of plantation drama. It takes place largely on a plantation, but right on, sort of on the eve of the Civil War. So a lot of the movie's action actually takes place during the war. So it's not just this sort of idyllic before the war portrait. But yeah, stereotypical black characters. The movie sort of mythologizes the South and the Confederacy and kind of contributes to this lost cause mythology that you might have heard of, this kind of idea that, the South was maybe sort of right, or at least romantic and virtuous in some way, even in defeat, which a lot of historians will point to as a major reason why a lot of race problems remained, even long after the war. So people have very divided feelings about the movie. We don't have to talk about it a whole lot. Obviously, we're not watching the film. But it's a pretty good sort of time capsule or a snapshot of not only the types of genres that were popular back then, but the way black characters would have sort of functioned in movies back then. So one of the many things the movie's known for, Vivien Leigh's main, leading performance is one, her romance with Clark Gable, the sort of sweeping cinematography. It was like many of these great big movies. It was very technically innovative. But it also has the distinction of being the film that led to Hattie McDaniel becoming the first African American to ever win an Oscar. So McDaniel plays Mammy, the sort of one of the faithful servants of the O'Hara family. Largely waits on Scarlett, who's the main character played by Vivien Leigh. And she's sort of a dispenser of wisdom, has a fair number of lines, and actually is a somewhat developed character, but she's a servant, she's a maid, essentially. I mean, really, when the film begins, she's a slave. Owned by the O'Hara family, as are most of the other black characters in the film. And there's a later scene that's kind of notorious, much later after the war's already started and the South is kind of, things aren't going great. Atlanta is sort of being besieged and Scarlett O'Hara's in bad straits. She runs across some old slaves that her father had formerly owned, and they're very eager to help her and assist her, and they're still very loyal. And that was a trope that was common in these types of plantation dramas. When they featured black characters at all, the black characters would usually be very contented slaves. They would be very happy to be slaves and to help their white masters. So, of course, people find that rather distasteful now, but there's also something to be said for Hattie McDaniel's performance. It is a good performance. She's an interesting character. She has a mind of her own, but obviously she had a very limited sort of range to work with. But McDaniel does win the Oscar that year for Best Supporting Actress. And she's at the ceremony, kind of a breakthrough, the first time an African American had won any kind of Oscar. And again, that's 39. So, very limited, maybe slight improvements over these decades, but it's really not until after World War II, as the book points out, that Hollywood starts moving towards a more honest, maybe authentic representation of black characters and life. So the book makes this argument that we don't really have to concern ourselves with, but the book argues that there's sort of a new social conscience that takes hold after World War II, that the authors of the book call the liberal humanist framework. We don't have to worry about that. They're just sort of pointing to a little bit of an advancement, a little bit of progress in race relations after the war, after World War II into the 50s. Also, the civil rights movement really gets underway during the 50s and then sort of accelerates during the 60s, led by Martin Luther King. And by 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act, which really for the first time sort of, does a lot to basically fight discrimination and sort of enshrine a lot more rights for African Americans. So we're kind of moving towards that. in the years following World War II, and we start to see that reflected a little bit more in movies. Like they point out in the book, you just start to get more movies like in the late 40s and the 50s that just acknowledge race relations and have black characters who might not just be servants or jazz dancers, just things are starting to expand a little bit. And you actually have some movies that really do deal with race more explicitly. They give a few examples like Intruder in the Dust, Home of the Brave, Lost Boundaries. And then they mentioned in the 50s, you start to get more movies featuring sort of more well-rounded black characters, like The Defiant Ones in 1958, Odds Against Tomorrow in 1959, The Manchurian Candidate, that they would later remake that movie, but the original one came out in 62, The Dirty Dozen in 1967, which starred Jim Brown, who was an NFL star, was a great running back for the Cleveland Browns. So he was a big, sports star who then crossed over into acting during the 60s. And that was, kind of a big deal at the time. And also there's a movie called In the Heat of the Night that comes out in 1967. Some of you might have heard of it. It's a pretty famous movie. Won some Oscars, I believe. And then it later became a TV show. And that's how I first experienced it, as a TV show that my grandmother watched pretty religiously, because I had to go to her house after school when my parents were working. So I would go and stay with my grandmother until, my parents got off, giving you too much info, I know. But the point is, so just to kind of capture the cultural significance of In the Heat of the Night, my grandmother was an old Southern lady who grew up in the segregated South in rural North Carolina. And as much as I am fond of her, she passed away a long time ago, she was a nice lady, but she had a lot of racist attitudes, stuff that was kind of instilled in her as a young person. But she really loved In the Heat of the Night. And In the Heat of the Night had a sort of a central plot that shows up in both the movie and the show. And it's really just about two characters and things that are happening around them. But it takes place in the Deep South. I think it's Mississippi. And it's about a white sheriff and an African-American detective who comes to the town investigating a murder, and the sheriff kind of has racist attitudes, and the African-American guy's from like a northern city, I want to say Philadelphia. I'm thinking of the movie mostly at this point, so I'm getting them confused. But they learn to work together, the white sheriff and the African-American detective. They sort of develop a begrudging friendship. And that's really what a lot of the movie revolves around, and the show too. Of course, other things happen. In the show, they solve multiple murders, and but they're the two main characters. And in the movie, the African-American cop is played by Sidney Poitier, who has been dead for a while. Most of us today don't really remember who he was, but if you ask maybe your parents or your grandparents, I don't know how old your parents are, but my parents definitely remember Poitier, and my grandmother also was familiar with him and was a big fan of his. So, not that this is the end-all be-all, but a lot of white people in the 50s and 60s really liked Sidney Poitier. He was an African-American actor who later directed some movies and continued to act all the way into the 90s. And he did a lot to sort of move things a little bit forward. He became very, very successful, very popular. He played a lot of debonair, sort of leading men, really became one of the first black actors in the U.S. to be a leading man, to have the opportunity to anchor a film, to be the main character of the film. I'd argue in The Heat of the Night, the film version, he really is the main character. The other guy in the film, I believe, well, I can't remember who plays the sheriff in the movie, but in the show, he's played by Carol O'Connor, who also played Archie Bunker in All in the Family, a very famous sitcom that was on back in the 70s. So, if your parents or your grandparents grew up during that time, these were big, big celebrities. Like, these actors were really famous. So there was a lot of cultural currency that kind of went with that. And the Heat of the Night was thought of as kind of, a little bit ahead of its time, showing, frankly, racism, racial divides, particularly in the South, but then also exploring the possibility of, bridging those divides and creating friendships and bonds that could go beyond that. So, not to sound cheesy, but that was kind of meaningful, and it kind of opened a lot of white people's eyes to some extent, and I think maybe softened a little bit of their prejudice. Just Sidney Poitier in general, because he was famous, people liked him, people wanted to see his movies. So seeing him and seeing the types of characters that he portrayed, characters that previous black actors would have never had a chance to play, it was meaningful to people of my grandmother's generation, who had very stereotypical sort of images and thoughts about a lot of minorities, and just seeing a wider range of possibility playing out on the screen. She was a big movie watcher. She liked TV shows. So that was one of the main ways that she was going to expand her ideas about different kinds of people. And that's a little bit sad because she wasn't really going to do it that much in real life, but she could do it through TV, through movies. And it changed things a little bit starting in the mid-century, 50s, 60s, when you had more performers like Poitier who could be popular amongst African American audiences and could also be accepted and popular amongst white audiences. So it took a long time, but it's starting to happen, by the 60s. And you also start to get characters played by Poitier and other famous actors of that time. I would say Jim Brown as well. They had chances to play roles that could have been filled conceivably by a white actor. For the first time, you started to get roles written for black actors that weren't specifically tied directly to their race or their sort of marginalized position in society. They were just like cool detectives or, whatever. They could be, war heroes, successful businessmen. They could be anything. And again, this was important for audiences who in previous generations had only seen black characters in sort of subservient roles, right? Never being treated as equals. But Sidney Poitier and his generation, they could have a much wider range of roles. They could embody a lot of different characters. And that was kind of important. That represented progress, in the 60s compared to what had come before. And then the book talks about in the 1970s, this new genre emerges that's often referred to as blaxploitation movies. A classic example being Shaft, the original, which comes out in 1971. So these are often movies thought of as being sort of designed for and marketed to primarily African American audiences. They often took place in distinctly African-American settings or milieus. Most of the characters would be African-American. The filmmakers sometimes were. In other cases, a lot of cases, they were white. But a lot of the actors, a lot of the roles would have been written with black actors in mind. And you would have often had, black heroes. Or even anti-heroes. Some of them were sort of charismatic criminals. Sometimes they could have been tough cops. A lot of the familiar crime drama sort of mechanics that we would have been used to from the golden age of Hollywood. Disillusioned cops, charismatic gangsters, the backdrop of, in some cases, economically impoverished neighborhoods. In some cases, they were really drawing on the real social realities of the 70s. Right, where a lot of inner cities were struggling financially. There were still a lot of issues, with racism and discrimination. So again, kind of like Michaud was doing decades earlier, they would take sort of a popular genre, cops and cops and gangsters, or in some cases even westerns or other popular genres, but instead of doing the usual Hollywood treatment, they would have black actors, black roles, maybe a screenplay or some other roles on the crew would be filled by African Americans, and it would be a film more marketed towards African Americans. But familiar genre conventions of the crime drama or the Western or whatever, familiar conventions with a different message, different content. Again, maybe a little bit more social commentary, but also entertainment. So those movies were popular in the 70s, not just amongst black audiences. White audiences enjoyed them too. And that's why the book says, by the late 70s, and then certainly into the 80s, Hollywood's sort of approach or treatment of black audiences, black characters, black roles, became a little bit different. And according to the book, you get at least slightly fewer stereotypical portraits of black characters by the end of the 70s, although there are certainly still some. And you also get fewer films targeted specifically to black audiences. And the legend has it that Hollywood executives kind of finally figured out that a lot of black audiences were watching the same movies as white audiences. So there wasn't always so much of a difference. And they actually realized that African Americans made up a big share of the overall movie-going audience. And see, for a long time, studio executives didn't think that. Again, they kind of subscribed to these racist stereotypes and thought, well, that's not a big, they're not a big part of my audience, so I'm not going to think too much about them. But by the end of the 70s, it was clear African Americans were a big part of the movie-going audience, as were other minority groups, right? It became clear that there weren't so many distinctions between different movie-going groups. By and large, a lot of Americans were watching the same movies, regardless of background or the color of our skin. So that kind of set up a new era during the 80s. And the book describes this as sort of crossing over, a period of crossing over. And what they mean by that is that a lot of black performers, or in some cases even black filmmakers, were able to cross over into mainstream Hollywood movies. And they found success with wider audiences. That's basically what they're talking about, and there is a lot of evidence for that. The 80s really becomes the first decade where you can get big budget, major studio movies to feature African American characters, in a lot of leading roles. I mean, I guess, again, Poitier did that a little bit in the 50s and 60s, but there weren't many others. By the 80s, a lot of different performers could find that level of fame. So maybe they weren't the very first, but you got a lot more of this. And the book mentions several of the names. Richard Pryor, who was a very well-known stand-up comedian who later transitions to acting. Again, a lot of people today might not remember him. You can ask older people in your family, but he was in movies throughout the 70s and 80s, even into the 90s. He developed a bad medical condition and sort of wasn't able to act much beyond the early 90s, but he was a big star in the 70s and 80s. He starred in a series of comedies, many of them also featuring Gene Wilder, who was another famous American actor, a white actor. So they were in films like Stir Crazy, Silver Streak, popular high-grossing comedies of the late 70s and early 80s. And a lot of people think Pryor helped to set the stage for Eddie Murphy, who got really popular in the 80s. He was on Saturday Night Live first, but then he transitioned to acting and was just a huge star. He was in 48 Hours, Beverly Hills Cop. So at a very young age, Eddie Murphy becomes a legitimate movie star, probably in a way that even Richard Pryor never did. So like Pryor, Murphy was a stand-up comic, had a background in comedy, but he's done all kinds of different roles, really, as an actor. Most people still think of him primarily as a comedic actor, and that probably is his greatest gift. But he's done some more serious roles as well, and he continues to act. He's had a very long career, but certainly Murphy has never been as big as he was in the 80s. Also, Whoopi Goldberg, who's still around. I don't think she acts very much anymore. She's on one of those like daytime talk shows or whatever, but she was a very big actress in the 80s, in comedies, also in drama. She was in The Color Purple, which was directed by Steven Spielberg, came out in 85. That's a big sort of landmark achievement. But she was also in a lot of comedies. You might have seen her in Sister Act. I know that was my first exposure to her. So a gifted, comedic actress, but also did serious roles. She was in Ghost, I think, as well. So these actors all got big. They all got famous during the 80s, and their fame, especially for Eddie Murphy, Whoopi Goldberg, carried over into the 90s as well. So they were the featured attraction in a lot of movies, and that's another thing that's big about the 80s. Not only do you get individual African-American stars who have a lot more options, but also you start to see white directors tackling more African-American subject matter, which would not have been common in earlier decades. So I mentioned Spielberg with The Color Purple in 1985. That's based on the book by Alice Walker, starring Whoopi Goldberg, was an award-winning film, critically acclaimed in the mid-'80s. All of the main characters were African-American, set in the South, very much about their struggle. A few years later, in 1988, Clint Eastwood directed the movie Bird, which was about the jazz musician Charlie Parker, who had died, prior to that, but was a, big deal in the jazz scene, kind of in the middle 20th century. Played in the movie, I think, by Forrest Whitaker. Yeah, that comes out in 88. So Eastwood, of course, a famous actor who by that point had already moved into being more of a director, although he still acted. So that's kind of significant too, right? Spielberg and Eastwood were sort of established big name filmmakers in Hollywood. So for them to tackle African American literature, African American subject matter, famous figures from, jazz and other sort of African American art forms, that also signaled that this stuff was becoming more mainstream. It was becoming something that Hollywood was willing to tackle and spend money on, whereas in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it would have been a lot tougher. But also, during the 80s, we have the emergence of Spike Lee, who directed Crooklyn, our movie for this week. A lot of you might be familiar with Spike Lee, even if you haven't seen a lot of his movies. He's become sort of a pop culture presence, I would say, even outside of his day job as a movie director. If you watch TV, if you're subjected to TV advertisement, you might have seen him in a recurring Capital One advertisement campaign where he appears along with Samuel L. Jackson, various NBA players, and I think Jennifer Garner, for some reason, is there with them. He's also, so he kind of appears in various places. He's in commercials. If you're a sports fan and you watch the NBA, you might know that Spike Lee is like a New York Knicks super fan. So anytime the Knicks are on TV, they'll show him in the audience, and he's usually cheering very loudly from his courtside seat. So he's just kind of a person that people have a general sense of who he is. You might know that he makes movies. Maybe you've heard of some of his movies, but this might be the first time you've actually sat down and watched one of his movies. Lee starts his career during the 80s. So his first movie is called She's Gotta Have It. It comes out in 1986. That's followed by School Days in 1988. And then Do the Right Thing in 1989. That was our originally scheduled film for this week, but I subbed it out for Crooklyn. Do the Right Thing is still generally thought of as maybe Lee's best film. His most powerful film. It's definitely got a lot of social commentary. It's somewhat controversial to many people. If you're interested, if you like Crooklyn, if you're interested in Spike Lee, I do recommend it. If you're gonna check out Lee, you got to eventually watch Do the Right Thing. That is sort of his opus. But he continues to make movies all through the 90s, and that's really where he finds more crossover success. He becomes a little bit more mainstream after Do the Right Thing. So he does Jungle Fever in 1991, Mo Better Blues with Denzel Washington in 1992. Also in 92 or maybe 93, he does Malcolm X. The first real big budget Hollywood treatment of that famous historical figure starring Denzel Washington. That was a big hit. And then Crooklyn comes out in 1994. So Lee continues to make films. He works well into the 2000s. He's still active. He's slowed down his pace. He was more active in the 80s and 90s. He's obviously a good bit older now. But he is still making movies. He's still an active creative force. One thing to note about Lee, what's kind of important about him, and he was very much not alone, but he talks a lot about forming his own production company once he sort of made it in the 80s. And this was an increasingly popular model for filmmakers. I've kind of mentioned this before. As Hollywood lost some of its power after World War II, as the government took all of those antitrust actions to strip away Hollywood's control over all aspects of movie making, one thing that did was it made it more possible for successful directors like John Ford, like Spielberg, like Spike Lee to create their own production companies. So they could pretty much be in charge of making their own movies. And they could also produce other directors' movies. So that's what Spike Lee does fairly early in his career. He creates his own production company, and then he sells his movies once they're made. He sells them to Hollywood studios. So, for example, with Crooklyn, he had a deal with Universal. So he makes the movie through his own production company. He hires the people he wants. He brings in his cinematographer, his preferred production designer, the people he wants for hair and costumes. He does the casting, makes the movie. He's obviously directing. His sister, Joy, is the screenwriter for this one, although I think Spike got a writing credit as well. But it's a little bit of a family affair, but it's also a lot of people Lee had worked with before. People that had done his cinematography, his music, his production design on previous movies. So he's in charge. He makes the movie the way he wants to make it. And then he sells it to a Hollywood studio, and the studio distributes it and facilitates the exhibition of it. And increasingly, that's what a lot of big-time filmmakers want to do. And still, today, that's pretty common to see. And Lee's talked about how it gave him freedom and it gave him the opportunity to tell his own stories by forming his own production company. But like I said, the screenplay for this particular movie is written by Joy Lee, who also appears in the film. She plays Troy's aunt, I believe, in the movie. So she has a small role, but she also wrote the screenplay. And Troy is in many ways based on her own experiences growing up as a black girl, as a young black girl in Brooklyn during the 70s, because Spike Lee and his siblings grew up in Brooklyn. So a lot of what we see in the movie is taken from their own lives, their own experiences. It's not supposed to be an autobiography, right? It's still a work of fiction. But there's a lot of clear parallels between the Lee family and the family we see in the movie. Spike and Joy's dad was a jazz musician, Bill Lee, just like the father character in the movie. Well, in the movie, I don't know if he's really jazz. It might be more like classical, but he's a musician, piano player. So they take a lot of autobiographical details, obviously their recollections of their neighborhood, what it was like growing up in Brooklyn during that time. They use a lot of that in the movie. But again, remember, the movie is still a work of fiction. So Joy is thought of as writing most of the screenplay, but Spike gets a story credit, I think, along with their brother, Sinke, is also a co-writer on this one. Just to run through a few of the other names that we might want to remember if we're thinking about different parts of the movie. The cinematography might grab your attention a few times. That's done by Arthur Jaffa, who also, I wanted to mention this movie earlier actually. I skipped over this part. But Jaffa did the cinematography for another really important movie that comes out in the early 90s called Daughters of the Dust. I thought about doing this movie for week 11, but it's an art movie. It can be a little bit difficult for some, but it has the distinction. So this movie, Daughters of the Dust, comes out in 1991, directed by Julie Dash, with cinematography by Arthur Jaffa, who also collaborated a lot with Spike Lee. So I just want you to think about this for a minute. Daughters of the Dust comes out in 91. It has the distinction of being the first American movie to ever get a mainstream release, to ever be theatrically released, that's directed by an African American woman. So we had earlier films directed by African American men, but it's not until 91 that we get a theatrically released feature-length movie directed by an African American woman. So Julie Dash has that honor of being really the first African American director in U.S. history, but it takes until the early 90s, for that breakthrough to occur. A lot of people would have guessed that it happened earlier, but not until 91. Daughters of the Dust is set in South Carolina, not far from where I'm from. It's a beautifully shot movie. I mean, again, if you're interested in African American cinema or any of this history, I would recommend it. Beyonce and a lot of contemporary entertainers have borrowed very extensively from the visual aesthetic of Daughters of the Dust. A lot of scenes on the beach with a lot of white and indigo, a lot of the imagery, lounging in trees, running along the shore. Like, that stuff has shown up in music and more contemporary movies. A lot of that stuff gets recycled. That's a cool movie, and it wasn't super well known when it first came out, but it's kind of got a more of a cult status now, and it's just really beautiful to look at. Jaffa does the cinematography for that one as well. One thing that you might notice with the cinematography is what they call an anamorphic effect. And this is done intentionally. It has to do with how they're manipulating film stock, the 35 millimeter film stock, but we don't have to get too much into that. It's really more of a projection technique, the way we're experiencing it as viewers. It's a projection format in which an image gets sort of distorted or stretched in what's called an anamorphic projection lens, which recreates the original aspect ratio with this kind of film. But the effect that they're trying to create is stretching the images so everything appears to be sort of distorted and made like taller and skinnier than it normally would be. So you should notice this anamorphic effect when Troy goes down south to spend the summer with her relatives. That's when they use the anamorphic effect. That's the only time that they use it during the movie, but it's very intentional, right? It's a great example of how a technical aspect of a movie can be used to help communicate a narrative element or a certain thing about character and meaning. So the reason they do it is because that's how Troy feels when she's down south with her family. She feels very restricted. She feels squeezed, like she can't really be her true self because her southern relatives are very different than her and her nuclear family. They kind of are a little more traditional, have sort of a different way of life and a different outlook. So Troy doesn't feel comfortable there. She feels stretched, squeezed, and sort of restricted. So they use that effect to make audiences really feel the way Troy feels. So that's a very cool little effect that they're able to achieve through that sort of anamorphic format. Also, a lot of people commented on the production design of this movie. So it's set in the 1970s. So the production design is really capturing a lot of those like period details that really make it feel authentic. So when we talk about production design, we're really talking about all visual elements aside from cinematography. So apart from camera work, if you're thinking about production design, it's kind of everything else that you see, like the interiors of buildings or sets that were constructed, for a particular scene. But also exteriors, when we're on the street, the way buildings look, the way the cars look. They had to get cars that would have actually appeared on the road back in the 70s, right? So production design really incorporates all of that. Everything that you see, the hydrants, the stoops, the cars, the sets, the interior of their house, right? The interior of the relative's house down south. All of that's production design. All right, so that was done by Wynn Thomas, who's also worked with Lee on other movies. So that was celebrated. Also, the costume design done by Ruth Carter, who also has collaborated with Lee on a lot of movies. So they had to get the costumes right. They wanted to get clothes that looked like the clothes that people really would have worn back in whatever year it was, 1974 or whatever. So Ruth Carter does the costumes, and then we have music by Terrence Blanchard. And Blanchard does the music for a lot of Spike Lee's movies. So he does an original soundtrack here, not an original score. So a score is when you compose your own music for the movie. That's what they did for Bullet back in the late 60s. We had an original jazz score composed for the film. But here, Blanchard does a soundtrack. So he collects a bunch of popular music that would have been heard back in the 70s. So that's another way that they recreate the era. They recreate that particular time by getting a bunch of R&B and soul and rock and roll hits from the 70s. From artists like Curtis Mayfield, Bill Withers. We hear a Jimi Hendrix song. We hear the Staples Singers, James Brown, the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder. Right? All of that stuff would have been popular during that time period. So the soundtrack is very important. But also, if you watch a lot of Spike Lee movies, you'll notice that there's a lot of background music that's often kind of symphonic. Like it just sort of sounds like violins. It's not overpowering, but it's often in the background, even during quiet scenes when actors might just be talking to one another. And a lot of that music actually is composed by Blanchard and his own sort of symphony, right, that he organizes for these movies. So they're filling in a lot of the background music. And Blanchard's a very accomplished composer, musician, but also he's picking songs that really represent that era for the soundtrack. And it's a great soundtrack if you like, that kind of music, if you like popular, stuff from the 70s. So if you're analyzing this movie, those are all specific areas that you could really dig into. The music, production design, cinematography, or costumes. There's a lot with all of that, plus the screenplay by Joy Lee. Also, a lot of really good actors in this movie. So Alfre Woodard, or Woodard, I think is how you say her last name. She plays our matriarch, the mother of the family. You may have seen her in other movies. She's a pretty well-known actress. She still is active, though she's a good bit older now. She's in TV a lot, as well as movies. Her husband is played by Delroy Lindo. He plays the musician, kind of a struggling musician. Obviously, their marriage has some problems, but They sort of repair things after some initial struggles, and he seems to be getting his career somewhat back on track. So not too strictly based on the Lee father, because he was a very successful musician by and large. This guy's a little bit more on the margins, but similar background, kind of a freewheeling, fun-loving, sort of carefree guy, maybe not the most responsible, so that leads to some friction between the two of them. Troy is played by Zelda Harris. She was a pretty prolific child actor, really hasn't done a whole lot of acting as an adult, but she's very good, I think, as Troy. Also, Isaiah Washington, pretty well-known actor. He plays Vic, their tenant upstairs, Vietnam veteran. That's another reference to the historical period. He's back from Vietnam. He mentions at one point that he has a lot of shrapnel in his back, so he's been injured during the war. If you're a fan of Grey's Anatomy, you should recognize Isaiah Washington. He's in a lot of Spike Lee movies as well. So a great cast. I think the child actors are good, even though a lot of them did not grow up to pursue acting, like I mentioned with Harris. But if you have a big family, or if you've ever spent time around a big family with a lot of small children, I think they really nail that feeling of chaos. It's very loud. The kids can be a little bit obnoxious, but that's how it is in a household like that with a lot of kids running around. They're fighting, they're yelling, they're arguing about what to watch on TV. I love the sequences when they're watching TV. Again, a great sort of time capsule of the 1970s. So we see them watching, I believe it's the Partridge Family, performing at one point. They also mentioned the Brady Bunch, so these were, of course, popular shows during the time, but also one of the brothers wants to watch the Knicks all the time. Like, the New York Knicks were very good during the 70s. They win the NBA championship on the night of the father's music recital, so that, of course, causes a conflict as well. Even when they're watching Soul Train, right, which their dad doesn't like because he's not a fan of that kind of music, but we see the kids watching Soul Train. That was a very popular show, not just for African American audiences. I mean, it was popular for everybody, but it was a culturally significant show in the 70s for a lot of black viewers, because it was one of the first times that what you might think of as like African American music or African American culture was sort of prominently featured on mainstream television. Like, it was right there for anybody who wanted to watch, and that had not been the case in previous decades. So that show kind of matters, for a lot of African American audiences during that time. Right, because it's another sign that they're beginning to maybe cross over a little bit more. Their culture is becoming a little bit more accepted, but we can see in the movie that there's still a lot of hardships. Their neighborhoods still have a lot of problems, and they're still trying to overcome prejudice. In some cases, prejudice that's maybe even held by their own extended family. So things aren't great, but we see signs of progress, and of course, this family, there's a lot of conflict, there's problems, but also a lot of love, a lot of affection, and a lot of good times too. So a lot of people think of the plot as sort of semi-autobiographical, basically just a young girl and her 4 brothers growing up in 1970s Brooklyn. But the larger thematic material, a lot of critics thought, really spoke more to black girlhood, and really the experiences of Troy as a young woman sort of coming into her own, but also having to assume a lot of responsibility because, of course, there's some tragedy near the end that I'm not going to give away in case you haven't watched the movie yet. So she's coming of age, she's dealing with her rambunctious brothers, her dad that can sometimes be a little flighty, tragedy in the family, and also just the basic sort of all-purpose, very relatable difficulties of growing up, the inevitability of change, all of those things. So that's partly why the movie was thought of as so good. It very much captures a uniquely African American experience, but it's also easy to relate to. Almost anybody can relate to some aspect of this family's life. It can be heartwarming, it's sad, it's funny. At times, it kind of runs the gamut, and it looks great. Visually, I think it's a real treat. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.